You obviously know where to start, and yeah, we're just gonna talk about civil code. If you are looking for a general law that governs family and property relations, it's just civil code. But let's talk about how it started, and I'm just gonna leave the rest to my group mates. The Philippine Civil Code is strongly influenced by the Spanish Civil Code. It was first enforced within the Philippines when we were still a colony by the Spanish Empire, and it actually remained in effect throughout the American occupation. The Commonwealth government was tasked to make a new code. While it was in the process, it was interrupted by the Spanish invasion and the World War II. Unfortunately, the Commission's records were later destroyed by Allied bombing in the Battle of Manila. President Manuel Rojas of the Third Republic created a new Code Commission. The Code Commission then completed the final draft of the new Civil Code by December. It was submitted into Congress, which enacted it into law through the Republic Act 386. And in the Civil Code took effect. Now let's move on to its content, starting with Law of Sales.
Thank you so much for that, Ken. And with that, let's go to the Law of Sales. What is the law of the sale of goods? The Sale of Goods Act applies to any contract where one person sells goods to another. What is the meaning of the Act of Sales? It is a formal document recording of the sale of property, particularly one prepared by a notary, authorized as state agent, and signed by the parties. The Act of Sale is to be signed before a settlement or notary public chosen by the buyer. Here in the Philippines, the Consumer Act of the Philippines Republic Act No. 1794 regulates the sale of consumer products on the Philippine market. It prohibits deceptive, unfair, and unconscionable sales acts and practices. The policy of the state aims at protecting the interests of the consumer, promote his general welfare, and to establish standards of conduct and business industry. The law of sale of goods is a collection basically of guidelines and liabilities that are put in place to provide a safety net for customers. The law imposes terms, conditions on transactions between a person or a company that enters into an agreement to sell goods.
Today, I'll be discussing a few essential requisites of an obligation. Every obligation has 4 essential elements: an active subject, a passive subject, the prestation, and the legal tie. Firstly, a passive subject, or a debtor or obligator. It is a person bound to the fulfillment of the obligation who has a duty. Secondly, an active subject, or creditor of oblige. That is a person entitled to demand the fulfillment of the obligation who has a right. An example of this is Romeo executing a contract of loan to borrow money from Juliet, whom he wishes to spend in courting Juliet. Next is the object or prestation, or the subject matter, who conducts the required to be observed by the debtor. The prestation to do is a positive personal obligation, and it includes all the kinds of work or service. An example of this would be the obligation of a painter to create an artwork for that person or for the person who commissioned him or her. Lastly is the juridical or legal tie, or efficient cause, that which binds or connects the parties to do the obligations. The legal definition of obligation is a binding tie which requires individuals involved to do something or pay for something under legal terms according to the law. For example, Eric has an obligation to pay for his speeding ticket within 60 days under the state law in North Carolina. In contrast, these 4 elements are a contract of loan wherein the active subject is the creditor, the passive subject is the debtor, the prestation is money to be borrowed, and the efficient cause is the contract. Next will be the sources of obligation.
forward to sources of obligations and what are its sources. In the current civil law, the legal documents and the legal facts are considered to be sources of obligations. The agreements or independent acts of will that are included in legal papers are made between two or more people with the goal of producing legal outcomes that would not normally happen. According to Article 1157 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, provide the sources of obligation, to wit, obligation arises from law, contracts, quasi-contracts, acts or omissions punished by law, and quasi-delicts. Article 1158 of Civil Code Law, obligations arises when imposed by the law itself and cannot be presumed. For example, an obligation arising from law is the payment of taxes. Second is Article 1159 Civil Code Contracts. Obligations arises from the stipulation of the parties. It has the force of law and should be complied with in good faith. For example, a contract of sale between a buyer and a seller in which the obligation arises. Article 2142 Civil Code Quasi-Contracts. Certain lawful, voluntary, and unilateral acts give rise to juridical relation of quasi-contract, to the end that no one shall be unjustly enriched or benefit at the expense of another. For example, X owed Y 1,000 pesos by mistake, X paid Y for 2,000, and now Y has the obligation to return the excess payment because there was a mistake in the payment, and this is called dissolution in debiti. Article 2177 Civil Code acts or omissions punished by law, responsibility for fault or negligence under a quasi-delict, as entirely separate and distinct from the civil liability arising from negligence under the penal code. But the plaintiff cannot recover damages twice for the same act or omission of the defendant. For example, under the revised penal code, murder and theft are prohibited. If you commit any of them, you will have the obligation to pay damages and fines or be put in jail. Article 2176 Civil Code Quasi-Delicts. Obligations arises from damages caused to another through an act or omission, there being fault or negligence, but no contractual relations exist between the parties. For example, X broke the car window of Y while playing basketball. In this case, X now has the obligation to pay the damages caused to Y due to X act.
Next to it is the requisites of a contract. In order for a contract to be legally binding, it must meet certain requirements, and these requirements are known as the requisites of a contract. Here are the 4 requisites of a contract that must be met for it to be valid. The first requisite of a contract is an offer. An offer is a promise to do or not to do something in exchange for something else. It must be clear, definite, and communicated to the other party. The second requisite of a contract is acceptance. Acceptance is the agreement by the other party to the terms of the offer. It must be communicated to the party who made the offer. The third requisite of a contract is consideration. Consideration is something of value that is exchanged between the parties. It can be money, good, services, or even a promise to do something in the future. The fourth requisite of a contract is the intent to create legal relations. This means that both parties must intend the contract to be legally binding. Contracts made between family members or friends may not always have this intent. It is important to remember that 4 requisites must be present for a contract to be valid. If any of the requisites are missing, the contract may be unenforceable or void. Remember to always read and understand any contracts before signing them. So now, keep on watching to learn about this classification of contracts.
Hello, are you familiar with the classification of contract? If not, I'm here to discuss to you. So there are 5 classification of contract. First one is the valid contract. The valid contract, no defect, and legally enforceable. It must qualify all the essentials of a contract. Next one is the void ab initio or inexistent contracts. Void from the beginning. This makes all those contracts that are not enforceable by a court of law as void. Next is the unenforceable contracts. Unenforceable until ratified, the contract can be enforced against any of the two parties. Next one is the rescissible contract. Valid but can incur injury or damage to one of the parties or third persons. Lastly is the voidable contract. Valid contracts but can be annulled in court. These types of contracts are defined in section of the Act. An agreement which is enforceable by law at the option of one or more of the parties thereto, but not at the option of the other or others, is a voidable contract. In tourism industry, all businesses must develop contracts and agreements to guide their interactions with customers, vendors, and other third parties. Your travel services agreement should discuss specific information and situations. Boilerplate contracts may not fully address your company's needs. You need to develop tourism terms and conditions that address the environment in which you operate your business. Example of contract are arranged tour contract, travel services contract, tour operator contract, travel agency contract, travel fee contract, and special provision for tickets, accommodation coupons, and more. That's all of my discussion. If you want to learn more, just keep on watching.
Tax law.
Did you know that the Philippines has one of the highest tax rates in Southeast Asia? Our tax system is one of the least friendly to taxpayers in the region, but don't let this fact discourage you from paying the right amount of taxes. The Philippine tax law has undergone several reforms. The most recent one is the Republic Act 10963, or the Tax Reform for Acceleration and Inclusion Act. In addition, the National Internal Revenue Code lays down the rules on taxation. It identifies who should pay taxes and the types of taxes that should be collected from taxpayers. Where do our taxes go? Taxes are the primary source of the revenue for the Philippine government. Taxes are spent on infrastructure projects, public services, welfare programs, and as budget of different departments of government. As citizens, we have to pay our taxes to help our nation and its development. For example, the government collects several kinds of taxes. Among them, personal income taxes, value-added tax, estate and donors tax, other percentage taxes, and documentary stamp taxes. These levies are collected on all types of revenue except when these are explicitly exempted by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. In conclusion, the 1987 Philippine Constitution sets limitations on the exercise of the power to tax. The rule of taxation shall be uniform and equitable. The Congress shall evolve a progressive system of taxation. If you want to know more about tax law, just keep on watching.
Now that you have been familiarized with what and how taxes work, let's proceed to discuss its principles. There are three main principles of a sound tax system. Number 1, fiscal adequacy. The sources of tax revenue must be sufficient to meet the demands of government expenditures. The revenue should be flexible or capable of expanding or contracting annually in response to variations in public expenses. Government funds should not be lower than what is needed. However, it should also not be more than that, because if so, the public would be overburdened with tax. Number 2, administrative feasibility. Tax laws and regulations must be capable of being effectively enforced with the least inconvenience to the taxpayer. It assures us that the tax system should be as simple as possible, clear and concise as to time and manner of how taxes are collected, assessed, and complied with. Number 3, theoretical justice. A sound tax system should be equitable and must be based on the taxpayer's ability to pay. This simply means that people with greater earnings should give a higher percentage of their income in taxes compared to those with lower earnings.
That's it for the 3 principles of a sound tax system. To further deepen your understanding about this topic, just keep on watching.
Next type of tax is income tax. Income tax is a type of tax government imposed on income generated by businesses and individuals within their jurisdiction. Income tax is used to fund public services, pay government obligations, and provide goods for citizens. Who is required to file income tax returns? First are the individuals, meaning they are the resident citizens receiving income from sources within or outside the Philippines. Next is non-resident citizens receiving income from sources within the Philippines. And last is aliens, whether resident or not, receiving income from sources within the Philippines. And then we have the non-individuals, meaning they are the corporations, including partnerships, no matter how created or organized. Next is domestic corporations receiving income from sources within and outside the Philippines. We also have foreign corporations receiving income from sources within the Philippines. And then we have estates and trusts engaged in trade and businesses. So who are not required to file an income tax? These are the individual whose earning does not exceed 250,000 pesos and who is a minimum wage earner. Also, we have an individual whose income tax has been withheld correctly by his employer, provided that such individual has only one employer for the taxable year. And also, we have an individual whose sole income has been subjected to final withholding tax or who is exempted from income tax pursuant to the tax code and other special laws.
Another form of tax is travel tax under the Presidential Decree 1183. This includes individuals who are leaving the country irrespective of the place where the air ticket is issued. Simply put, you must pay an extra cost each time you travel abroad. Remember that your tax varies on your ticket. For example, you are flying from Manila to Hong Kong, and your seat is economy class. As a citizen of the Philippines, you have to pay 1,620 pesos. If you are an OFW or balikbayan, you don't have to pay the said travel tax. Let's say your flight was cancelled. What will happen to your travel tax? According to the Presidential Decree 1183, you can refund it. Yes, you heard it right. You can refund your travel tax. Travel taxes are refundable only if you have unused tickets, have paid the tax twice, you were offloaded, have your seats downgraded from first class to economy class, or if your flight was cancelled. In our industry, travel taxes were utilized for tourism-related projects and initiatives, with 50% going to TIESA, 40% going to CHED, and 10% going to NCCA. That's all for today. See you on the next one!